If I had known that the blood soaking into my hands belonged to the son of the man who once destroyed my world, maybe I would have let go. But mercy has a cruel way of choosing its victims, and that night, it chose me. The rain had been falling all evening, turning the city into a blur of trembling lights and echoing horns, and somewhere between the noise of engines and thunder, I heard the scream, a sharp, terrible sound that ripped through the narrow lane like a soul being torn apart. I ran without thinking, my feet splashing through puddles of mud and oil, and when I reached the source, the world seemed to stop breathing. A boy lay twisted beside a shattered motorcycle, blood pulsing from his chest in steady, desperate rhythm, his face ghost-pale beneath the dim streetlight. The crowd around him stood still, half curious, half terrified, their eyes blank with the same indifference I had once seen outside the hospital where my mother died. I fell beside him, pressing my palms against the wound, whispering to a God I had stopped believing in, and when his lashes fluttered and I saw his eyes, my breath caught. The face beneath that blood was one I had prayed never to see again. His name came to me like a curse whispered in the dark. Arav Malhotra, heir to the empire that had trampled my family into dust. My stomach turned cold. Every part of me wanted to pull away, to let fate balance its own cruel scales. Yet my mother's voice echoed in the rain. Don't let hate make your hands useless, Mira. Even pain must serve a purpose. I stayed. I pressed harder, feeling his heartbeat fade and then return like a stubborn promise, counting each breath as though I could bargain with death itself. Around us, the city kept moving, cars passing, people watching, no one helping. The hospital stood just beyond the next corner, its glass doors glowing like salvation. Yet when I dragged his body there, soaked and shaking, the guards crossed their arms and demanded money I didn't have. I begged them, told them he was dying. But compassion has a price tag in this city, and I couldn't afford it. So I knelt on the wet ground, holding a stranger's life between my palms as the night stretched into eternity. I tore a piece of my dupatta, pressed it into the wound, and whispered every prayer I knew, the taste of rain and blood mixing on my tongue. Time blurred. The sound of the storm became the rhythm of my heartbeat, and in that endless waiting, I began to hate and forgive him all at once. When the ambulance finally arrived at dawn, I couldn't stand. The paramedics pulled him from my arms, their gloves clean, their eyes distant. One of them asked if I was family, and I wanted to laugh, because after fighting death for someone, you become something closer than blood. I followed them to the curb, my vision dimming, my body heavy from exhaustion. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of iron and silence. The ambulance doors opened, and I lifted, my head to thank whoever had called it, but the words froze on my tongue. A man stepped out of a black car, his shoes untouched by the mud that clung to mine, his eyes sharp enough to cut through memory itself. The world tilted. I knew that face. Every poor soul in this city knew that face. Devraj Malhotra, the man who had looked at my starving mother years ago and turned away. The man who had laughed as our stall burned. The man I had sworn to make kneel one day. He stared at me, at the blood on my clothes, at his son lying unconscious behind me. His silence was worse than shouting. It was the sound of power realizing it might owe something to the powerless. My throat closed, my heart hammering so loud, I thought it would give me away. He took one slow step toward me, rainwater glistening on his sleeve, and his voice came low and sharp as a blade. "What did you do to my son?" The guards moved before I could answer, their hands gripping my arms, and as they dragged me backward toward the wet pavement, all I could think was that by saving his heir, I might have just written my own death sentence. Before I ever held a scalpel or saved a life, I held rotten vegetables in trembling hands, whispering to them like prayers, hoping the world would see the worth in a girl who sold dreams for the price of tomatoes. When they released me from that suffocating police station, My body still shook from exhaustion, my hands raw from where the guards had grabbed me, and the smell of blood lingered beneath my nails, like a curse that refused to wash away. I wandered the empty streets until the first orange light of dawn touched the edges of the city, and when I finally reached the market, the sight of it nearly broke me. The same place that once felt alive now stood hollow, the tarps sagging under last night's rain, the smell of mud and spoiled onions clinging to the air. This was my home, my battlefield, and my cage. I stood there for a long time, listening to the echoes of vendors shouting prices, hearing ghosts of voices that weren't really there, and for the first time since I could remember, I felt smaller than the dust beneath my feet. My story had always begun and ended in this market. My mother used to say that every morning here was a fight, and every evening was a quiet surrender. The mornings began with the clang of metal trays, the smell of coriander and desperation, and the chorus of hundreds of voices all selling survival in different forms. We would spread out our small heap of vegetables, the crooked carrots, the bruised tomatoes, the wilted spinach that nobody else wanted, and call out to the passers-by with hope disguised as confidence. 2 kilos for 10 rupees, I'd shout, forcing a smile until my cheeks hurt, knowing that every coin we earned wasn't just money. It was a little more time before hunger came back. But beneath that noise was another rhythm, my dream whispering in my ear, like a forbidden secret. While others sold food, I was selling time, saving every paisa in a small metal tin hidden behind the cart, imagining the day it would be enough to pay for books, for classes, for something beyond this mud and misery. My mother often caught me watching the hospital across the street, the one with glass walls that reflected sunlight like arrogance. "That's where I'll be someday," I'd tell her. She would smile gently, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, her eyes soft but heavy. "Then sell your vegetables with pride, Betty," she'd say. "Even dreams need feeding before they can grow." Every night, when the market quieted, I'd spread my old notebooks across the floor and study under a flickering lantern, while my mother mended torn sacks beside me. The pages smelled of dust and candle wax, and my pen scratched like a heartbeat against the silence. I memorized bones and blood vessels from pages I barely understood, repeating words out loud until they stopped sounding foreign. The people in the market laughed when they saw me. "A doctor? You can't even afford a new sari," they mocked. I smiled back because if you let them see the hurt, they won. My mother would wait until they were gone before whispering, "Let them laugh. Even the sun rises from dirt." Her faith became my armor, and her voice became my compass. But the world has a cruel way of testing those who dare to dream without permission. The cough she used to hide behind laughter grew worse. I'd hear it echoing through the nights when I studied, sharp and wet like a broken promise. She brushed it off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, saying she was fine, that I should focus on my books. I didn't know then that I was studying anatomy while her own lungs were slowly betraying her. Still, she pushed herself every day to the market, standing beside me as if willpower alone could hold her body together. That morning was no different. The sky was white with heat, and the air was thick with the smell of ripe tomatoes baking under the sun. I remember feeling proud of our stall. The vegetables glistened under the light, and for once we had enough stock to last the day. My mother was resting in the shade, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, though the weather was cruelly warm. I felt something like peace, a dangerous, fleeting thing in a life like ours. And then it happened. The roar of an engine shattered the moment, the sound so loud it felt like a scream from the earth itself. I turned just in time to see a black car hurtling toward our stall, its tires slicing through puddles, its metal shining like polished greed. In one violent instant, wood cracked, vegetables flew through the air, and the world turned red and green and brown all at once. I fell backward, the shock stealing my breath, the smell of crushed tomatoes and gasoline filling my lungs. People shouted, but their voices came from far away, muffled by the ringing in my ears. I pushed myself up, dizzy, and saw what was left of our cart: splintered wood, scattered coins, my mother's shawl caught in a tire tread. I stumbled toward the car, trembling with rage and disbelief, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The door opened with a soft click that sounded too calm for the chaos it had caused. A man stepped out, his clothes immaculate, his shoes untouched by the dirt that coated my skin. His face was hidden by dark glasses, but even before I saw the emblem on the car door, a silver M, my heart already knew. I had seen that mark before, years ago, on the business card I found beside my dying mother. He removed his glasses slowly, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage of my world, then landing on me with the same detached cruelty that had destroyed my childhood. The market fell silent around us, every whisper dying in the heat. And as he said my name, softly, like he'd always owned it, I realized that fate had brought him back not for forgiveness, but for another kind of punishment. The day Devraj Malhotra laughed at my misery, I stopped praying for miracles and started forging one with my own blood. The sound of the car's brakes screamed through the market, grinding against the earth like metal scraping bone, and for a single suspended second, the world froze. The front bumper of the black luxury car stopped only inches from my fallen body, the broken pieces of our vegetable cart scattered like the remains of a shattered life around me. My hands trembled as I tried to stand, my mother's cries echoing somewhere behind the ringing in my ears, and through the rising cloud of dust and the stench of gasoline, I saw the door of the car open. Out stepped a man whose very presence seemed to silence the chaos of the market, Devraj Malhotra. He was the kind of man whose suit alone could feed a family for a year, whose perfume smelled of money and power, and whose eyes carried the calm cruelty of someone who had never been told no. He stood before me, tall, composed, untouched by the dirt and the chaos his car had created. His face didn't flinch when he looked at the mess, the ruined vegetables, the coins scattered across the mud, my mother kneeling to pick them up with shaking hands. He looked at us as though we weren't people at all, just an inconvenience, a stain on the smooth road he owned. "You're blocking my way," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, as though my pain was an ordinary thing that didn't deserve attention. His words were sharp and soft at the same time, the kind of tone rich men use when they've already decided who's beneath them. My mother's voice broke as she whispered, "Sir, please, this cart is all we have. It's how we eat." She tried to shield me, tried to explain that accidents happen, that we would fix it somehow, but he didn't even look at her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crisp notes, and let them fall into the mud at our feet. That small sound, the paper hitting the wet ground, was louder than any insult. I stared at the notes, watching them soak up the dirt, feeling something shift violently inside me. My hands balled into fists. That money was meant to buy my silence, to buy my humiliation, to make my pain disposable. I bent down, picked up the muddy bills, tore them clean in half, and threw them back at his polished shoes. My voice came from a place I didn't know existed within me. "Someday," I said, "you'll stand where I stand." For a second he looked surprised. Then he smiled, a cold, slow, deliberate smile that froze me more than any shout could have. "Girls like you don't stand," he said quietly. "You kneel." His words carved themselves into my bones, and then he turned and walked back to his car without another glance. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing my insult inside a world I could never touch. But not everyone left. Standing by the car, half in shadow, was a boy, his son. He couldn't have been much older than me, maybe 18 or 19, his eyes too gentle for the wealth that surrounded him. He watched the scene silently, his gaze fixed on me with something that wasn't pity, but recognition. When our eyes met, he hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, to undo what his father had done. But then the engine roared back to life, and the moment was gone. He got into the car, and they drove away, leaving behind crushed tomatoes, scattered dreams, and a promise I didn't yet know I'd spend my life keeping. The market slowly came back to life after they left. People whispered, avoiding my eyes, pretending to care while secretly relieved it wasn't their turn to be stepped on. My mother wiped her tears and touched my shoulder. "Forget it, Mira," she whispered, her voice heavy with something more than sorrow. "Men like him don't see people like us. They see walls and weeds." But I couldn't forget. I didn't want to. I stood there in the wreckage of my small world and made a vow to the dust, to the gods, to my mother, and to myself, that I would make Devraj Malhotra remember this day, that I would rise from this dirt and one day force him to look up to me the way I had been forced to look up to him. I didn't know how. I didn't have a plan, or money, or influence. But I had pain, and pain, when it festers long enough, becomes power. I rebuilt that cart piece by piece, my palms raw from hammering, my heart burning with a quiet, deadly resolve. I studied harder, worked longer, saved more. Every humiliation became a brick in the tower I was building toward freedom. And yet, destiny isn't satisfied with silent wars. 2 weeks later, the universe returned him to me, not as a rich man on his feet, but as a boy on the ground, his blood soaking into the same dirt his father once disdained. I found him on the roadside, his body twisted, his breath fading, his face pale beneath the dust. For a moment I didn't recognize him. Then the light caught his features, and realization struck like lightning. It was the boy from that day, the son who had watched in silence. As I knelt beside him, pressing my hands over his wound just as I had done for my dying mother, I realized that fate had a cruel sense of justice. The son of the man who had once crushed my dreams was now gasping for life in my arms, and I was the only one who could keep him alive. Sometimes life doesn't break you to end you. It breaks you to see whether you can grow again through the cracks. The weeks after that accident dissolved into a blur of loss and silence. The market that once roared with voices now whispered about us like we were a warning. My father's creditors began arriving one by one, men who had once shared tea at our stall, now pounding on our door with iron fists and colder hearts. They dragged away our remaining stock, our scales, even the cart that carried my mother's laughter for years. Every debt paid with memory felt like losing another piece of her before she was gone. My father, once proud, once loud, sat in the corner of our dark room, his face hollowed by guilt. I still remember his trembling hands clutching his chest the night the last of our savings disappeared. The doctors never came. We couldn't afford for them to. The morning he died, the sun rose without warmth, and the air felt heavier than earth. But grief is greedy. It never comes alone. My mother's health began to crumble like brittle paper. Her cough deepened until every breath sounded like a plea. Yet she smiled through it, determined not to let me see her fear. I carried her from one hospital to another, each more polished and indifferent than the last. The nurses barely glanced at her, their words mechanical, rehearsed. No admission without advance payment. I begged them to let her stay, told them I would work, clean, sell anything. But bureaucracy doesn't bargain with desperation. I remember kneeling at the gate of the largest hospital, the same place where I once watched ambulance lights reflect off my mother's hopeful eyes, and realizing that mercy in this city had a price tag higher than a poor girl's love. That night, I sat beside her on the pavement outside those shining glass doors, her body trembling under the thin shawl that could no longer hide how fragile she'd become. The air smelled of antiseptic and rain, the kind of scent that belongs to people on the other side of the wall. She looked up at me, her hand small and cold in mine, and whispered words that burned hotter than any fire I've known. "Promise me, Mira," she said, pausing to breathe through the pain, Promise me you'll build a place where no one is ever turned away." I nodded, though tears blurred my vision, because saying yes was easier than imagining a world without her. I wanted to tell her I would, that I would build it with my own blood if I had to. But before I could speak, again, her fingers slipped from mine, and silence filled the space where her breath had been. I don't remember how long I sat there holding her. The city continued moving around us. Cars, footsteps, laughter, like we were invisible. I wanted to scream at the sky, to ask what sin we'd committed to deserve this kind of ending, but no answer came. When the last light of evening faded, I dug her grave myself in the small patch of earth behind our house, the soil rough and cold beneath my hands. I had no coffin, no priest, no flowers, just her bracelet, the silver one she never took off even when we had nothing left. I slipped it from her wrist, pressed it to my lips, and swore I would keep her promise. I told the earth as I covered her that this would not be the end of our story. That night, I sat beside her grave until dawn, the air thick with fog and the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. My body ached, my nails were caked with dirt, and yet for the first time in my life, my heart felt carved from something unbreakable. I realized then that grief was no longer my enemy. It was my teacher. It taught me how to listen when the world stopped speaking, how to move when every step hurts, how to find purpose inside pain. I decided that I wouldn't just survive. I would rise so high that no gatekeeper could ever close a door in my face again. The first rays of sunlight crept across the ground as I stood to leave, clutching her bracelet like a talisman, its metal still warm from the night I'd spent holding it. My eyes drifted toward the hospital at the end of the road, the same one that had turned her away, and for a moment, I imagined tearing down its glass facade, brick by brick, replacing its greed with compassion. I didn't yet know how, but the fire had been lit. I turned to walk home, the bracelet heavy around my wrist, when something caught my eye near the gate where she had taken her last breath. There, half buried in the dust and morning dew, lay that same bracelet gleaming faintly beside a visiting card. I bent to pick it up, my fingers trembling as I read the name embossed in gold, Devraj Malhotra and Sons. In that moment, I understood that destiny wasn't done testing me. It was merely drawing the map toward my next war. The day I found my mother's bracelet beside that gold-edged card, I knew destiny wasn't done punishing me. It was merely changing its disguise. All night the wind played with that visiting card, sliding it across the floor like a taunt. I stared at the name, Devraj Malhotra and Sons, until the letters blurred into the shape of every humiliation he'd ever left me with. My mother's bracelet gleamed beside it, the only thing that had survived her grave, and together they looked like a message written in irony, the symbol of my love resting against the signature of my hatred. By morning, the anger inside me had hardened into resolve. If the man thought I would stay bowed to the dust he'd buried me in, he didn't understand what the dust can do when it decides to rise. His office stood in the richest part of the city, a tower of glass that touched the clouds as if trying to own even the sky. Inside, everything smelled of polished stone and expensive silence. The marble floors mirrored me back like a ghost trespassing where sunlight was forbidden to the poor. Every step echoed too loudly, but I didn't stop. When the secretary asked for my name, I gave it with the steady calm of someone who has already lost everything once and therefore fears nothing. Devraj Malhotra looked up from behind a desk, large enough to bury my entire house beneath it. His eyes were the same as the day he had crushed our cart, cold, clinical, the eyes of a man who believed compassion was a weakness poor people invented to comfort themselves. "If you've come for compensation," he said, sliding open his drawer without even asking who I was, "take the money and go." The arrogance in his tone scraped against every scar inside me. I stepped closer, my voice trembling but unbroken. "I didn't come for your money, sir. I came for your memory. You owe me that much." He frowned, searching my face for recognition, but there was none. That hurt more than the insult. The idea that the pain defining my life was to him just another forgettable inconvenience. I told him who I was, the girl from the market, the daughter of the woman who had died outside his hospital's closed doors. His pen paused mid-air, yet his gaze stayed blank. "I meet 1,000 people a day," he murmured. "I can't remember them all." Behind him, by the window, stood his son, Arav Malhotra, the boy whose blood I had once tried to keep inside his body with my bare hands. His eyes met mine, filled with guilt that neither of us had words for. I leaned forward until he could smell the dust of my world mixing with the cologne of his. "One day," I said quietly, "you'll stand where I stand and learn what it means to be refused." For a second, something flickered in his expression. Annoyance, maybe curiosity, but he quickly buried it beneath that smile of his, the one carved from power. "People like you don't rise, Miss Singh," he said smoothly. "You endure." His words were meant to dismiss me. Instead, they branded me. I turned away before he could see the tears that anger was forcing from my eyes. Iorav took one step forward as if to speak, but his father's sharp glance froze him. I walked out of that office without a single coin, but with a fire in my chest that money could never buy. That evening, the city's lights blurred through my tears, each one a tiny promise that I would make them remember my name. I didn't know that destiny was already listening. 2 days later, I found an envelope slipped under my door, its paper thick, its edges scented faintly of smoke and power. My name was written in handwriting too elegant to belong to anyone from my world. Inside was a letter stating that I had been awarded a full medical scholarship. Fees, lodging, books, all paid. No sender, no signature, only a wax seal marked with a single silver letter, M. For hours I sat on the floor, turning the letter over, half convinced it was a cruel trick. Could it really be coincidence, or was it the same invisible hand that had once dropped money into the mud, now trying to buy redemption with education? Every instinct told me to reject it, to spit on the generosity that came too late. But my mother's voice returned, soft and steady. Build a place where no one is refused. If this was a door, even one opened by the man I hated, I would walk through it for her sake. That night I packed my world into one small bag, a few clothes, a notebook, my mother's bracelet, and a letter that smelled of mystery and guilt. As the train rolled away from the city, the lights shrinking behind me like dying stars, I pressed the envelope to my chest and whispered a vow to the wind rushing past the window. You tried to buy silence, Mr. Malhotra. Instead, you've bought my rise. Years later, when the newspapers called me Dr. Meera Singh, I finally uncovered the truth hidden behind that silver seal. The scholarship that had lifted me out of the slums had been paid for in full by the same Devraj Malhotra, whose arrogance had buried my mother. The man I had sworn to destroy had unknowingly built the wings I flew with. And destiny, I realized, was never merciful. It was poetic. When I stepped back into the city that had once buried me, the streets didn't recognize me, but the ghosts did, and they whispered that this time I had come not to beg for mercy, but to measure justice. Years rolled over me like storms over a stubborn sea, and every one of them shaped me into something harder, quieter, more deliberate. Medical school had taught me science, but life had taught me endurance, and the two together were a weapon the world didn't yet know I carried. When I finally returned to the city, its skyline glittered like a field of knives, beautiful and merciless. The train hissed into the station, and as I stepped onto the platform, I felt the air bite the way it used to when I was a barefoot girl selling vegetables under these same bridges. Only this time, I wasn't a ghost wandering the ruins of my past. I was Dr. Meera Singh, the woman the newspapers had begun to call the miracle of the slums. I rented a narrow building at the edge of the old market, the same market that had once echoed with my cries of 2 kilos for 10 rupees. The walls were cracked, the roof leaked, and the smell of medicine mixed with dust. But I called it my clinic, my fortress of kindness. Word spread faster than I expected. People came barefoot, carrying hope instead of money, and I treated them all because each patient was a conversation with my mother's ghost, a way of keeping her promise alive. Some days I worked until dawn, stitching wounds beneath candlelight, using my own shawl when bandages ran out. At night, when the city slept, I would walk past the grand hospitals that had once turned us away and whisper to them that their walls would one day answer to mine. The city changed slowly around me, yet its cruelty remained the same. I watched wealthy men drive past my patients without a glance, the same way they once drove past me. But I didn't hate them anymore. I pitied them, for their world was colder than the marble they built their names upon. My name began to travel through the alleys, carried in whispers and prayers. Dr. Didi, the woman who never says no. And with every life I saved, a piece of my old fear died quietly inside me. Then one afternoon, the heat hung heavy and still, and I heard the sound of an engine that didn't belong in my street. I looked up, and there it was, the black car, the same symbol that had followed me through every shadow of my life, polished and untouchable. It rolled to a stop in front of my clinic, scattering children who played near the steps. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The door opened, and out stepped Devraj Malhotra. Time had taken its toll on him. The arrogance that once wrapped around his shoulders like armor had thinned into something fragile. His hair was gray at the temples, his skin drawn tight across his face, but his eyes still held that familiar sharpness, the kind that could wound without a word. For a long moment we just stared at each other, two histories colliding in the same space. He looked at the sign above my door, Sanj Clinic, the name I had chosen after my mother, and a shadow passed over his face. "Doctor," he said at last, his voice unsteady, stripped of the authority that used to rule it. "My son's dying." The world seemed to narrow around those 3 words. I wanted to ask which son, though my heart already knew. The irony burned, how fate circled back like a vulture that never left. I motioned for him to follow and led him through the narrow corridor that smelled of antiseptic and incense. Every step felt heavier, not because of fear, but because of the memory of all the steps that had brought me here, from the dirt of the market to the dust of my mother's grave, to the marble of this man's empire. When we reached the hospital ward he had brought me to, the machines hummed a steady, indifferent rhythm. I paused at the door, my hand on the metal handle, every cell in my body tightening with recognition. I pushed it open slowly, the sound of the hinges louder than it should have been. And then I saw him. Arav. His face was pale, almost translucent, the boy who had once stood silent beside his father now lying small beneath the web of tubes and monitors. The green light on the heart monitor flickered weakly, its rhythm uneven, faltering. I felt the ground tilt beneath me as a lifetime of memories folded into this one image. The market, the accident, the blood, the night I'd held him and begged him to live. Devraj stood behind me, his breath ragged. "Please," he whispered, "save my son." The arrogance was gone. In its place was a father's naked fear, the kind that strips every man of his power. I wanted to speak, to tell him what irony he'd brought to my doorstep, but the words wouldn't come. The monitor's beeping began to slow, each sound a countdown echoing through my chest. I rushed forward, my hands finding Arav's pulse just as the line on the screen flattened into silence. The room filled with that terrible continuous tone, the sound of endings, and I looked up into Devraj Malhotra's eyes, seeing the reflection of the girl he'd once ignored, now standing between his son and death. What neither of us knew then was that this heartbeat, stolen and returned, would tie our fates together forever. The first time I saved Arav's life, it was an accident. This time, it was a choice carved out of every scar his family had left on me. The corridor outside the ICU smelled of antiseptic and rain. I stood over the table, sleeves rolled to my elbows, the hum of the machines like the rhythm of a war drum beneath my skin. Arav lay before me, the once carefree boy from that black car, now reduced to a fragile body, wrapped in wires and failing breaths. 14 hours blurred into one long, breathless moment, in which my world narrowed to the trembling line of his pulse. Each beat felt like a plea, not from him, but from the universe itself, an order that I must finish what destiny had started years ago on that wet road. I moved like instinct, not memory. The nurses had long stopped counting the hours. Only the sound of my voice filled the room as I called for suction, for more adrenaline, for silence. Sweat and fear ran together down my spine. I thought of my mother, of how her heart had slowed in my arms outside a locked hospital door, and I whispered to the boy on the table, "You don't get to die while I still breathe." When the monitor flatlined, I pressed harder, my hands bruising against his chest, each compression a defiance, a conversation with every god who'd ever ignored me. Then, suddenly, the line twitched, and the steady beep-beep returned like a heartbeat the world had been holding back. I leaned against the table, dizzy, my fingers trembling from exhaustion. Outside, through the small glass pane, I could see Devraj Malhotra, pacing, like a man who'd lost the map to his own power. His immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his phone silent in his pocket. For the first time, he looked human, small, frightened, and waiting for mercy from the kind of hands he once refused to shake. When I stepped out to meet him, he looked at me as if the floor beneath him depended on my answer. "He'll live," I said quietly. The relief that passed across his face was too raw to witness. He sank to his knees, a sound escaping him that didn't belong to pride or money but to something older, sadder. "Thank you," he whispered, the words breaking halfway through. I wanted to hate him in that moment, to remember every time he'd looked at my mother like she was invisible, every time he'd measured worth in currency instead of compassion. But hate requires distance, and he was kneeling too close. The sound of his gratitude felt like a wound reopening, not for revenge, but for reckoning. "You don't owe me," I said, my voice steadier than my heart. "You owe the next person you turn away." He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave the ICU door. I left him there and walked back into the room, the machine still whispering life into the air. The city outside was soaked in the scent of monsoon. Thunder rolled somewhere far away, reminding me how small our stories were against the sky. I sat beside Arav's bed, watching his chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile truce between past and present. His face looked softer now, stripped of privilege and pride, and for a fleeting moment I saw the boy he might have been, before wealth taught him silence. As the hours passed, I dozed in the chair, my mind drifting between memories. I saw the market again, the crushed cart, my mother's bracelet shining in the dirt, Devraj's cold eyes as he turned away. I remembered the day I found that scholarship letter with its silver seal marked M, and wondered if this, too, had been part of the same unspoken chain of debts. Perhaps saving his son was not mercy. Perhaps it was payment long delayed. The monitors hummed their steady lullaby. I thought he slept. But then a sound, soft, cracked, almost a whisper, pulled me back to the present. I looked up. Arav's eyes were open, unfocused at first, then finding mine with a clarity that froze my breath. His lips moved, dry and pale, shaping a name that no one in this city should have remembered. A name buried beneath years of struggle and reinvention. "Mira," he said, the syllables trembling through the hiss of the oxygen. For a moment the world stopped, the machines, the thunder, even my heart. And all I could think was that fate had just reminded me how fragile forgetting really is. What began years ago on that rain-soaked street wasn't finished. It had merely been waiting for him to wake. Forgiveness is just another word for unfinished revenge, and when Arav spoke the truth, I finally understood that love and hate were sometimes the same fire, burning you even when you think you've put it out. The weeks following Arav's recovery felt like standing inside a quiet storm. Everything looked calm on the surface, but beneath it, 1,000 unsaid things raged and waited. He spent his days in rehabilitation, relearning how to walk without the machines, and I spent mine avoiding the questions I wasn't ready to ask. I told myself my work at the clinic needed me, that my patients couldn't afford my absence, but in truth, I couldn't bear to look at him and see both the man I had saved and the ghost of the man who had destroyed my mother. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. It likes to put its victims in the same room and watch them learn mercy. One evening, as the city's heat gave way to the kind of dusky stillness that smells of rain, Arav asked to see me. I walked into his room expecting silence, maybe gratitude, but not confession. He sat by the window, his face pale in the fading light, fingers tracing invisible lines on the bedsheet as if mapping the words he was about to say. "I remember everything," he began, his voice low, fragile, yet heavy with something ancient. "The market, the fire, the day my father's car crushed your cart." My hands went cold. I wanted to interrupt, to stop him before he reopened the wound I had learned to live around, but his eyes held me still. "My father's guilt ate him alive, Mira," he continued. "He funded your education in secret. Every book, every fee, he paid for it. It was his penance." For a long moment, the room seemed to tilt. The hum of the machines faded into a faraway echo, and all I could hear was my heartbeat, loud, uneven, furious. I shook my head before I even found my voice. "You're lying," I whispered, though some part of me already knew he wasn't. "He wouldn't even look at us when we begged for help. He let my mother die." Arav's eyes didn't waver. "He never forgave himself for that," he said quietly. "Every time he wrote a check for another student, he thought he was paying a debt. But when he saw your name on that scholarship list, he said it was the first time he felt peace." I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to curse every god that had played us like chess pieces. But the sound that came out was laughter, raw, bitter, helpless. The man I had hated more than death itself was also the one who had made me into what I was. Without his guilt, I might never have become Dr. Mira Singh. Without his cruelty, I might still be a girl selling vegetables in the sun. Destiny, I realized, doesn't choose sides. It just keeps score. Arav looked at me with a gentleness that felt like another kind of punishment. "He wanted to make it right, Mira. Let me help you finish what he started. Let me help you build the hospital you once dreamed of." His voice cracked on the word dream, and I saw in him not the heir of Devraj Malhotra, but a son trying to atone for a father's sins. I didn't know what forgiveness meant anymore, but I knew what duty did. I nodded, not for him, not for his father, but for my mother's memory that still whispered through every breath I took. And so Sanj Hospital was born, a place that carried her name, her promise, and my defiance. It rose from the edge of the slum where she had once sold vegetables, its white walls gleaming like redemption made tangible. Arav handled the funding and construction. I oversaw the wards and training. Together, we built something neither of us fully believed we deserved. Every brick felt like a prayer answered too late. On the day the sign went up, I stood beneath it and whispered, "For you, Ma. No one will ever be turned away again." The opening day arrived with fanfare. Cameras flashed, politicians smiled, and the poor gathered in the courtyard as if witnessing a miracle. Arav stood beside me, his smile tentative but proud. As I walked through the corridors, the smell of new paint and disinfectant filled me with something close to peace. But peace is just the pause before destiny remembers its unfinished work. It began with a faint crackle, then the scent of smoke, sharp, unnatural. Shouts echoed from the east wing. Flames licked at the curtains, swallowing the white walls we had painted with hope. Panic surged through the halls as alarms wailed and people ran. I rushed toward the fire, my voice breaking from the heat and the chaos. "Get everyone out," I screamed, pushing through the smoke to reach the patients trapped inside. The air turned thick and cruel. My lungs burned, but I refused to stop. And then, as I reached for the emergency exit, the handle refused to turn. I pulled harder, coughing, eyes watering from the smoke, until I realized the truth. Someone had locked it from the outside. The metal seared my palm, and for the first time since my mother's death, fear took me completely. The roar of the fire grew louder, hungrier, the oxygen around me turning to poison. Through the blur of heat, I saw a shadow move behind the glass. A tall figure, still, deliberate, watching. For a heartbeat, I thought it was Devraj returning from the grave, but when the smoke shifted, I caught the glint of a familiar silver bracelet on the figure's wrist. Before I could call out, the glass cracked. The world exploded into light, and everything I had built to honor Mercy became an inferno of betrayal. I built my dream out of ashes, but fate is cruel. It always sends fire to see if you've truly earned what you've built. Smoke has a smell that never leaves you once you've breathed it in. It's the scent of everything you thought was indestructible, turning to memory. The fire that devoured Sanj Hospital didn't just eat through walls and ceilings. It clawed through every vow I had ever made to my mother, through every late night I'd spent building hope where only despair had lived before. Flames ran wild across the wards like angry spirits, painting the hallways in a violent orange glow. I could hear the screams echoing off the marble, children, nurses, old men, each voice a plea that sliced through the roar of burning air. I ran without thinking, my lungs filling with smoke until every breath was a punishment. The fire alarm blared overhead, but the sprinklers had failed. The water tanks were dry, sabotaged, the fire chief would later say. I didn't care about cause or conspiracy then. All I knew was that people I had sworn to protect were trapped in the blaze that bore my mother's name. I wrapped a wet cloth around my mouth, shielding my face with my arms, and pushed deeper into the inferno. My hands blistered as I tore through debris, dragging bodies from rooms that had once smelled of medicine and cleanliness, now blackened with soot and grief. Somewhere between the smoke and the chaos, time stopped making sense. I was back in the old market, the air filled with the same stench of burning, the same helplessness that had filled my chest the night my mother died, outside locked gates. This time, though, I was the gate. I was the wall that refused to open, and the guilt of that realization burned hotter than the fire around me. My body screamed for rest, but I kept going because every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in the flames, whispering, "Don't stop, Mira. Not yet." And then I saw him. Through the haze and the flicker of collapsing beams, a figure stumbled forward. Devraj Malhotra. I froze, thinking the smoke was playing tricks on my mind, but then he called my name. His voice was hoarse, his clothes singed, his skin streaked with soot, but his eyes were unmistakably alive. "You shouldn't be here," I shouted, coughing through the smoke, but he just shook his head. "You saved my son," he rasped. "Now let me save you." Before I could react, he shoved me backward toward the exit, his hands gripping my shoulders with surprising strength. I fell against the doorway, my knees slamming into the ground, and in that single moment, a beam cracked above him. The world tilted into a slow-motion nightmare as fire swallowed the space between us. He didn't move away. He didn't even try. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in his life, and in that gaze, I saw everything. Pride, regret, and the kind of love that can only exist inside guilt. Then the ceiling came down. The next thing I remember is waking up on the pavement outside, my face wet, the air thick with sirens and the smell of rain that had come too late. Someone was shouting orders. Someone else was holding an oxygen mask to my face. I tried to speak, but the words dissolved into coughing. I looked around for him, for Devraj, and saw them pulling his body out from the wreckage. He was still breathing, barely. I tried to get up, but hands pressed me back down, voices telling me to rest. I didn't. I crawled toward him, through puddles of ash and water, until I could reach his hand. It was burned, trembling, but warm. Hours later, he lay in the ICU, his chest rising shallowly beneath the oxygen mask. The room was cold, sterile, a cruel contrast to the chaos of the fire. Arav stood beside me, his face pale, eyes red, a child again despite his age. I sat on the other side of the bed, my hand still shaking from exhaustion. The machines beeped softly, measuring time the way only hospitals know how. Precisely, mercilessly. He opened his eyes once, barely, and gestured for me to come closer. His voice was a whisper fighting through pain. "I gave you your dream," he said slowly, every syllable cracked. "So you'd forgive me. But I never forgave myself." His confession wasn't a plea. It was a release. Tears slipped down his face, streaking the soot that still clung to his skin. For a second, I saw the man he might have been before pride turned him cruel. A man who could have been kind if the world had taught him how. I wanted to tell him that forgiveness isn't something you can buy, that he hadn't given me my dream, but merely returned what he'd stolen. I wanted to tell him that I didn't hate him anymore, that hate was too small a word for what we had both endured. But before I could speak, the monitor's steady rhythm faltered. One long, unbroken tone filled the room, the sound of finality, the sound of all the things left unsaid. Nurses rushed in, their voices distant, hands moving fast over his chest, but I stood frozen, watching the line on the screen flatten. The man who had once destroyed my world and then tried to rebuild it was gone. The monitor screamed louder than I ever could, and in that terrible noise, I realized the truth. Some debts are repaid only in silence. Sometimes death doesn't end stories. It simply changes the way they haunt you, because ghosts aren't made of ashes. They're made of unfinished promises. The morning after the fire, the city awoke to headlines written in bold, merciless letters. Business tycoon Devraj Malhotra, D's saving doctor who built Sanj Hospital. His face stared out from every newspaper and television screen, captured mid-smile in photos that looked more human than he had ever seemed in life. Reporters turned his final act into redemption. The same newspapers that once glorified his cruelty, now calling him a man of compassion. It was strange watching the world mourn the man who had both destroyed and rebuilt me. Stranger still was how grief can soften even the hardest truths until they feel almost forgivable. I didn't cry at his funeral, but something in me cracked quietly, the way old walls do when the foundation beneath them shifts. Arav stood beside me through it all, his father's funeral pyre reflecting in his eyes, his hands clenched around the same silver bracelet I once found outside the hospital gate. He looked nothing like the fragile boy I had pulled from death's edge. His face was carved by loss, his posture carrying the weight of legacy. When the last ember faded and the ashes turned to dust, he turned to me and said in a voice stripped of youth, "Let me finish what he started, Mira. Let me make it right." I wanted to tell him that some things couldn't be finished, that guilt can't be repainted as goodness, but something in his tone stopped me. He wasn't speaking as Devraj's son. He was speaking as the man trying to walk through his father's ruins without becoming them. So, I nodded. Together, we began again. Under Arav's leadership, the Malhotra Empire shifted its heart from profit to purpose. The same factories that once filled the air with smoke began producing low-cost medical equipment for government hospitals. He sold off luxury projects to fund community clinics, and I watched in silent astonishment as the city that once ignored us began to whisper our names with reverence. We expanded Sanj Hospital beyond the slums, built new wings, added free wards, trained young doctors who had once been street children. Every brick we laid felt like defiance against the past, as if we could build high enough to escape it. Yet even as we built, a shadow lingered. Late at night, when the corridors fell silent, I sometimes thought I heard footsteps echoing from the old East Wing, the one that had burned first. I would smell smoke for a second too long, feel the air tighten, and then it would vanish. Arav brushed it off as my mind refusing to let go of the trauma, but I saw it in his eyes too. That quiet unease, that fear that maybe the fire had not ended everything it was meant to. Months passed. The hospital bloomed again, full of laughter, cries, and life, the sounds that once felt like redemption. Arav and I worked side by side, our partnership becoming something deeper, though neither of us dared to name it. There were nights when we sat together on the hospital terrace, the city lights glittering below, and he would speak softly of his father. "I used to hate him," he admitted once, "but now I just wish I'd known him before he forgot how to love." His words drifted into the wind, heavy with the ache of unfinished reconciliation. And then, one night, as I returned from a late surgery, I found an envelope waiting on my desk. There was no sender's name, no address, just my name scrawled in jagged handwriting across the front. I tore it open, half expecting another patient plea or an anonymous thank you. Instead, a single piece of paper fell out. On it, 3 words, written in thick black ink that bled slightly into the fibers. "He's not dead." At first I laughed, a short broken sound that didn't belong to humor. It had to be some cruel joke, a twisted reminder from someone who'd read too many headlines. Devraj Malhotra was gone. I had seen his body, heard his heart stop. Yet the longer I stared at those words, the colder the room became, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My mind began to rewind, recalling the reports I'd ignored, the rumors of a second body found near the East Wing, the missing ambulance records, the night guards who couldn't remember who drove the last van out. I grabbed my phone to call Arav, to share the letter, to hear his voice steady me back into reason. But the line rang once, twice, then went dead. I tried again. No answer. Panic tightened around my chest. I left my office, the corridors suddenly too quiet, the flickering lights stretching my shadow into something monstrous on the walls. When I reached his office, the door was slightly open. Papers lay scattered across the desk, the chair knocked sideways, and the faint smell of iron filled the air. My eyes caught something on the floor, a glint of silver in the moonlight spilling through the window. I stepped closer, and my heart stopped. It was the bracelet. My mother's bracelet. The same one I had buried her with. The same one Devraj had once returned. The same one Arav had kept as a token of memory. But now it was stained, the chain broken, and across the white tile a small streak of blood led toward the door. I followed the trail into the hallway, calling his name, my voice swallowed by the dark. The security cameras flickered, the lights hummed and died, and somewhere deep inside the hospital a door slammed shut. When silence returned, I was alone, with only that blood-stained bracelet in my hand and the echo of 3 impossible words pulsing in my head. He's not dead. The past never dies. It only hides in the shadows of your victories, waiting for the right moment to crawl out and remind you that every triumph you've earned still belongs to it. The night I found the blood-stained bracelet was the night the city stopped sleeping for me. Every streetlight seemed to flicker in warning, every whisper of wind carried the sound of my name, and every unanswered call turned the silence between me and Arav into a wound I couldn't close. The letter that claimed Devraj was alive had begun to feel less like a cruel trick and more like a riddle carved by fate. For days I tried to chase reason, But reason doesn't exist where ghosts live. The CCTV footage from the hospital vanished. The night guards remembered nothing, and the police reports came back with blank spaces where answers should have been. Someone had erased the truth and left only traces sharp enough to bleed from. Then came the call. A static-filled voice on the other end, low and trembling, whispered 3 words that froze the air in my lungs. The market ruins. No name, no explanation, just that. I knew which market. The one where I had spent my childhood selling tomatoes and dreams. The one where my mother had coughed herself to death beneath the city's indifference. The one Devraj Malhotra's car had once driven through like a curse. I hadn't set foot there in years. It had been torn down to make way for a new mall that never came. The land lay abandoned now, cracked, overgrown, forgotten, just like the promises buried beneath it. I arrived after midnight. The sky was heavy with clouds, the moon veiled, the air thick with the smell of rust and rain-soaked earth. Broken stalls lay scattered like bones, and somewhere in the distance, a loose sheet of metal clanged against the wind. I moved through the wreckage slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand, until the beam landed on something that didn't belong to the ruin. A wheelchair. It stood beneath a broken lamp, half in shadow, half in the pale spill of light, and in it sat a man whose face my soul recognized before my eyes could believe it. Devraj, I whispered, the name escaping me like a breath I hadn't meant to release. He turned slowly, the movement stiff, his hands scarred and trembling against the metal wheels. His skin bore the story of the fire, burns climbing up his neck, one side of his face mapped in melted lines. But his eyes, those sharp, merciless eyes, still burned with the same impossible clarity. "You can't bury guilt," he rasped, his voice scraping against the night like gravel dragged across stone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I felt anger rising in me, thick and acidic. "You're supposed to be dead," I said finally, the words trembling somewhere between accusation and disbelief. He almost smiled. "That's what they needed to think," he answered. "That's what you needed to believe." My knees threatened to give way as I stepped closer. "Why?" I demanded. "Why fake your death? Why disappear? Why make us mourn you only to come crawling out of the ashes like some—" I stopped, choking on the sentence. "To protect you," he said simply. "And Arav." His hands clenched on the armrest. "The fire wasn't an accident, Mira. It was a message. There are men who don't forgive redemption. They profit from guilt. When I began turning the company toward your hospitals, they saw weakness, a threat. They wanted me gone. They still do. I stayed dead to keep you safe." His words landed heavy, the ground beneath me suddenly unsteady. I remembered the missing footage, the erased files, the untraceable letter. It all began to make sense, and yet none of it did. "You could have told us," I said. "You could have told him." Devraj looked up then, and the expression on his face hollowed me out. "Arav knew," he whispered. "He found me first. He begged me to stay hidden until it was over. That bracelet you found, he left it behind to warn you." My mind fractured between disbelief and horror. Arav had known. The boy I had saved, the man who had promised to finish his father's redemption, had been living between 2 worlds, one of the living, one of the dead. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice breaking through the wind. Devraj's eyes flickered toward the darkness behind me. "They took him," he said, "because they couldn't take you." The night pulsed around us, the shadows shifting like they were listening. I felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken things pressing on my chest. For years, I had thought my story was about revenge, about mercy, about paying debts that weren't mine. But standing there in the ruins of my beginning, staring into the half-dead eyes of the man who had written my fate, I realized I had only reached the edge of the truth. "You can still walk away," he said softly. "You've already given enough." I shook my head. "You're wrong. I haven't even started. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, the same silver seal pressed into its corner. "This is where they'll be," he said. "You'll have to finish it." His hand trembled as he held it out, and for a moment our fingers brushed, the same strange bond of fire and forgiveness that had always tied us together. I took the paper, but before I could ask more, a sound split the night. A single gunshot, distant but close enough to shake the air. Devraj's body stiffened, then slumped forward, the light flickering once before dying completely. I dropped to my knees beside him, the letter slipping from my hands. His eyes stared past me, wide and glassy, but there was still a faint smile on his lips, like a man who had finally paid his debt in full. I stood, the wind howling through the ruins, the letter crumpled in my fist, and as I turned to leave, his voice, hoarse, disembodied, almost carried by the air, seemed to whisper behind me, "Mira, every life you save is another life you owe." The words followed me into the darkness, echoing louder than the storm, and I knew then that this story wasn't ending. It was beginning again, somewhere between the fire, the blood, and the unburied ghosts that refused to rest. If this story touched something inside you, don't let it fade here. Share it, so someone else can feel it too. Tell me in the comments what moment stayed with you the most, and what you would have done if you were in Mira's place. Your one like, your one word, your one share, keep stories like this alive. Stay with me till the next tale, because every ending here is just the beginning of another.